Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today we welcome back Daniel Batten. He is of CH4 Capital. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Hey, great to be here, Nick. Thanks for the invite.
Now, Daniel is a tireless Bitcoin advocate, specifically on the environmental side of things. So one of Daniel's main efforts right now is to spread the awareness of methane emissions that are going on at the open landfill level, and how Bitcoin mining specifically can help mitigate those emissions and overall have an enormous net positive impact for the environment. The Bitcoin Layer is sponsored by River. Make sure to check out river.com today or the link below in the description. River is our preferred place to purchase Bitcoin. Now, when you're buying Bitcoin, guys, there are several considerations. Number one, should I be using an exchange? Is the exchange custodying their own Bitcoin? Is the exchange using platforms to custody that we don't know? Is the exchange leveraging its Bitcoin for other purposes? Well, with River, we know that River does not use leverage of any kind. River also uses its own multi-sig solution so that your Bitcoin are not held by anybody else. So it's a very important thing to understand about what River offers. Now, River also has Lightning Network integration and a lot of other really exciting features. Go check out river.com today. Daniel, what is the latest on the environmental front? What is the latest on the fight to explain to the world that not only is Bitcoin a worthwhile consumer of energy, but that Bitcoin can be an incredibly positive force for the future of this planet?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's really interesting. When you go beneath what you read in the media, you actually find out pretty fast that there are actually a lot of supporters of Bitcoin mining. And I'm finding them out all the time. Like, to give you an idea, the World Economic Forum has recently come out and has said some very positive things about Bitcoin's potential to mitigate methane. It's also done a review of what's happening in Africa with helping to bring energy abundance to Africa. We found out just yesterday that within the United Nations that artificial intelligence data centers and Bitcoin mining are the only two pre-vetted forms of methane mitigation that the United Nations approve of. Um, the Environmental Defense Fund that is setting up methane mitigation all around the world, they're very interested in methane mitigation using Bitcoin mining. So a lot of these big institutions around the world already understand deeply that methane mitigation needs to happen. We know the United Nations say it's our strongest lever to reduce climate change. What many people don't know is that Bitcoin mining is really one of the only two forms that can do it at scale and very profitably. And what got me particularly excited about landfill gas mitigation is that half the world's landfills right now have no option to be able to mitigate their methane emissions profitably. So just to back up a little bit, if you have a landfill, it'll produce methane through rotting waste, which is rotting without the presence of air. And for a lot of those landfills in the world, that just vents freely into the atmosphere, which is not only an environmental hazard, it's also a health hazard. It's responsible for more than 1 million premature deaths every year, according to the United Nations. But from a Bitcoin miner's point of view, it's a tremendous waste of power. And that stuff you could be sending to a generator and converting into electricity and using to mine Bitcoin. And we have 4 Bitcoin mining companies, 3 in the US, 1 in Australia, who are already using landfill gases as forms. This is not theory, this is history. So what we're looking to do at CH4 Capital now is to scale that up big time, to start to do more projects, more sites, to start to use vented methane emissions rather than flared emissions. So the difference there is that's methane that's just not even being burnt in a flare stack. It's just going freely into the atmosphere and using that as a fuel source. Because when you do that, you're going to burn up 10 times more methane emissions, which is great for the environment. But it's also really good for Bitcoin This is a story I've been telling to a lot of Bitcoiners. I was recently speaking in Madeira at Bitcoin Atlantis. And the point that I made there, to your point, Nick, around environmental FUD, people believe that Bitcoin is bad for the environment because it uses a lot of energy, right? And we know that using a lot of energy is not a proxy for being bad for the environment at all. In fact, if you use a lot of energy, what it means is you can help to build out and incentivize the renewable grid. You can curtail more, you can use more curtailed solar energy. But another thing that it means, if your power source is emission negative, so in other words, if your power source is something like methane that would have gone into the air from a landfill or a farm or wastewater or oil and gas field, and you're using that as a power source, then you want Bitcoin to use as much energy as possible, because the more energy it uses, the more emissions that it can stop going into the environment. So there's this equation that I've been working on, which is calculating how many megawatts of energy would Bitcoin need to use in order for the entire network to go emission negative. And that answer is 320 megawatts, which is not a lot. So to put that in context, right now Bitcoin draws about 20,000 megawatts of power. So that's just more than 1%. So if just more than 1% of the Bitcoin network was powered by venting landfill gas, the entire Bitcoin network would be emission negative. And why is that significant? It's significant because it would end all environmental FUD about Bitcoin. This is the haymaker. There is no comeback when you can claim Bitcoin is bad for the environment, when the entire network is emission negative, and it's become the first network, the first industry in the world to have achieved that feat without offsets. It's an extraordinary possibility that Bitcoin uniquely has. It's still in front of us. We haven't realized that opportunity yet, but we're not starting at ground zero. We already are mitigating through methane mitigation 7.5% of Bitcoin's network emissions. So 1 in every 13 tons of emissions has already been mitigated right now. And we believe that in a short time, like this decade, we can definitely take the entire network emission negative, ending environmental FUD, ending one of the handbrakes to stop bull runs in their tracks, as Elon Musk did about 3 years ago. Bitcoin will be resilient against a well-known celebrity ending a bull run by tweeting some environmental FUD about Bitcoin. That's how significant it could be. It would also end the regulatory hostility against Bitcoin mining companies, which is all predicated on this myth that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment. So it would be an extremely important regulatory hedge. And it would just allow mining companies to get on with what they do well, which is mine Bitcoin, rather than having to meet every single week with some regulator to explain why they should be allowed to continue mining and shouldn't be taxed at 30 cents on the dollar, and shouldn't be facing quasi bans, as could be the case in Europe right now, based on misunderstandings about energy profile in Bitcoin.
So you mentioned the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, acknowledging the pro environment aspect of Bitcoin. However, you have the EU moving to potentially outright ban Bitcoin mining or
I would say
quad.
quasi ban. They won't be outright banning, but they'll do things that they'll make it difficult. They might be taxes. There might be disincentives to invest in Bitcoin.
And as
So
well
it'll be
as
done.
the
Yeah.
U.S. government proposing an excise tax on Bitcoin mining, and we actually saw in the latest budget from the White House that the collection of that tax is already baked into the budget going forward. So there's definitely plans to introduce this. So my question to you, Daniel, is where is the fight now, and how are you fighting it, and where?
Yeah. Well, really, it's on two fronts. One front, and this is the slow and the hard front, is to educate people that a lot of the arguments that are used against Bitcoin are utterly false. For example, that more energy consumption is bad. To educate people that without Bitcoin mining, you're not going to have a renewable transition at the same pace you could, because Bitcoin mining is the only way that you can get an off grid off taker for renewable energy that otherwise isn't going to get grid interconnected. You're talking about queues at the moment to get grid interconnected in the States that are taking 60 months. That's 5 years just to get onto the grid. Well, who's going to start a business proposition, or who's going to get financed if it's going to take you 5 years to get onto the grid? So when you have these renewable operators who are able to use Bitcoin before they get grid interconnected, it gives them a first user. It helps them to get funded. It shows that they can get revenue even before they're grid interconnected. That's going to be very important for the renewable build out. So part of it is just educating people. But you know what, Nick? That's slow and hard. We're not talking about an energy literate population. People don't understand what grids are. People don't understand that you need to constantly counterbalance supply and demand. People don't understand the supply and demand dynamics of energy, and that you need more energy and more flexible energy users in order to incentivize more renewable energy to get onto the grid. Those subtleties are lost, and it's just so much easier to shout Bitcoin is bad because it consumes the energy of the latest country of your favor. So we need to do that anyway. We need to continue the education process, but we actually need to do something which is much more powerful than that. And that's why I've been really bullish on using landfill gas as a source, because the way to pull the rug under the feet of the people who currently have it in their heads that Bitcoin is bad for the environment and that's all there is to it, is you turn a supposed negative into a positive. You show that by consuming more energy, you'll be mitigating more emissions. And governments are courageous to a point, but when it becomes point blank obvious that you are taxing something that is the single best method we've ever had to mitigate methane at scale and profitably without government incentives, people aren't stupid. And that's a pretty simple message. And to tax something that was actually demonstrably an environmental net positive, not less harmful, but environmentally net positive, would never fly politically. It would be impossible. So, in terms of the fight, as it were, the best way to really take this fight is to shift the narrative so much that the more energy consumed, the better for the environment the Bitcoin network is. And that's going to be using a whole lot of Bitcoin mining rigs on landfills in containerized solutions, drawing power from landfills that were previously venting their gas into the atmosphere, telling the story about all these projects, talking to the landfill owners, talking to the people from the UN, who would all agree that if it weren't for these Bitcoin containerized solutions, there'd be no option to profitably be able to run these projects. Now, if we can get in 1 year, we don't have to go completely emission negative to achieve that. We just have to show decent progress. And my belief is if we can take 4 venting landfills in a year, we tally that up, those 4 venting landfills, these are not big landfills, these are mid-sized landfills running Bitcoin mining rigs with generators on site. That would be enough to mitigate another 10% of Bitcoin's network emissions. If we could do that in a year, then I believe all the environmental NGOs, or at least the major ones, would start to see that Bitcoin now has realized its theoretical potential and is actually doing what it's claimed to be able to do for a long time, and that's mitigate emissions at scale. To let you know, Nick, so I'm regularly in touch with people who are in environmental NGOs. I talk to environmentalists all the time because it's important to understand their perspective, understand their concerns, understand where they're coming from, but also to ask the question, what's the point at which you would be convinced that Bitcoin was not evil? What's the point at which you would be convinced that Bitcoin was positive? What would it take? And so I asked these questions. They said, hey, look, if we could show that in a year we'd mitigated 10% extra emissions above and beyond what we'd done, would that mean something to you? And the answer categorically is absolutely it would. It'd be astonishing. We don't believe you can achieve that, but if you can, that would be a game changer. So these are people in environmental NGOs. These are people who are running ESG investment committees that currently cannot deploy cash into Bitcoin, not a single Satoshi, because someone senior up in their fund has said that it's bad for the environment or that it doesn't tick the ESG box. But they've all said that if you could do this, it would tick the ESG box. And in fact, it would tick it very strongly. And I can see a world in the future where if you're managing an ESG fund, you would be questioned by not investing into Bitcoin because they're not funds that actually have a lot of options available to them. which can both get a good return and strongly tick their ESG criteria at the same time. So this can be a game changer for them.
Now, Daniel, I want to ask you about you lay out the statistics and the numbers very clearly that each additional single landfill vented Bitcoin mine can net reduce the emissions of the network. And with only a few sites, you can actually start to tally up how much we can mitigate in terms of methane emissions. But while the facts are great, the numbers are great, you and I both know that most of the real fight is within the propaganda lanes and needs to be fought head on with an awareness of who is putting out the propaganda. So let's pick on Senator Elizabeth Warren for a second. Now, when Senator Warren comes out with anti Bitcoin legislation proposals or ideas, even ideas, the US populace goes right after her donors, right after and right into who is paying the bills to make some of those policies come out. In that way, we can identify the source of the propaganda. So if you're telling us that if Davos and the UN are coming with the acknowledgement, even we saw the Financial Times come out with it recently, more and more outfits are coming out with the awareness. It should make it easier to identify from where the intense fight. So is it ignorance or is it propaganda, Daniel? Where is it coming from? Help us identify who is on the other side of some of this, because you're laying out the facts clearly. It's pretty hard to deny it. So there must be
It's a
something else.
combination. It's a combination. So it's propaganda wrapped in ignorance. And so there is a propaganda layer. And um, just so this doesn't sound conspiratorial, so my background is basically either starting technology companies or investing in technology companies. So I've spent the last 20 years of my life dealing with disruptive technologies. And so this is not the first time that I've seen this drama play out. Whenever you have a disruptive technology, you will always have the incumbent which launches a FUD campaign against the disruptor. It always happened. It happened with our technology. We had a niche product for molecular biologists, and suddenly our potential customers were coming to us with all sorts of nonsense that they'd heard from our competitor about our product, which was completely made up. But it was not designed to be wrapped in truth or shrouded in truth or even to convince our customers, but just to stall their decision, to get them feeling doubt. FUD stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So it's a well-known phenomena. It's a psychological phenomenon to stop an incumbent, to rather protect the advantage of an incumbent over a disruptive technology. So Bitcoin is a disruptive technology. Who does it disrupt? It disrupts bankers and it disrupts central banks. And so it's no surprise that the people who have been leading the arguments against Bitcoin have been the Bank of International Settlements, the Dutch the Central Bank of the Netherlands, and the European Central Bank. They've been the three chief architects. And then on the political side, if you look at the politicians who are arguing strongly against it, if you look at their funding sources, it's bank funded. So it's the people who are the disrupted who are the funding sources for the campaigns against Bitcoin. Now, they can't acknowledge that directly. So what has to happen is you choose an attack vector. And so the attack vectors of choice have been, of course, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam, it's used by criminals, and it's bad for the environment. From time to time, they'll try a different strategy, such as Bitcoins are psychopaths. They tend to get abandoned if they don't get much traction, and they'll double down on the ones which have the more traction. Now, because of the times we live in, because of the zeitgeist, the one which has had by far and away the most traction has been it's bad for the environment. The narrative that's used by criminals is now being debunked pretty heavily, including within the US Treasury now. So that's getting less traction. But it's bad for the environment is really being doubled down on. Now, the reality is that in the last 18 months, out of the 8 peer-reviewed papers on Bitcoin and the environment, 6 of them said there's positive advantages to Bitcoin. Only 2 of them cited negative externalities. Okay. Of the 3 independent reports that were written about Bitcoin, all 3 of them cited positive environmental externalities. KPMG, Institute of Risk Management, and the Takuda Foundation. 3 papers, 3 independent studies on 3 different continents. As you said, the Financial Times has started to flip their perspective. The World Economic Forum, who said that Bitcoin will use all the world's energy by 2020, now has had 2 in a row videos which have supported the positive environmental case of Bitcoin. So we are starting to see these big institutions, these heavyweights, even the media, starting to flip the narrative. Now, that's all very well. However, at the same time, last year, you've got to remember you had a non-peer-reviewed commentary by Alex DeVries using a technique called Bitcoin energy use per transaction, which has been debunked triply in peer-reviewed research and by Cambridge Judge Business School, and yet it pervaded 10 mainstream news media articles. So that's what we're fighting against. Most of the public don't know that the peer-reviewed literature is supporting the positive environmental case of Bitcoin. Most of the public don't know there's been these 3 independent reports. Most of the public don't know that the Financial Times has come out supportive of Bitcoin. The World Economic Forum has come out more supportive lately. The UN is even coming out more supportive. So politicians are able to play off the general ignorance of the people who are still relying on mainstream media accounts, which for the most part are still heavily weighted negative towards Bitcoin. So that's what the politicians are riding on. That's why they're still able to say these things with impunity and not have it challenged by the masses, because the masses will believe what they read, and what they read is telling them that Bitcoin is bad for the environment, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Now, what then happens is the non-governmental organizations, the environmental NGOs, the Greenpeace US, the Sierra Clubs, the environmental working groups of this world, they're people who, I know these people, I talk to these people, some of them are my peers. I protested alongside them in about 20 years ago in some cases. So I know the way these organizations work. They are not putting out propaganda. These are fundamentally good people who are just fundamentally misguided, who have not done the work to understand the true environmental case of Bitcoin, have latched onto a perspective, partly at a time when some of it was more true, because there was a time in Bitcoin's history when it was using mostly fossil fuel. There was a time when there were off-grid coal stations that were powering Bitcoin. So I have some sympathy for why they might have formed that perspective, but I cannot stop the fact that these people have not reviewed that perspective, have not updated their thinking, have not challenged it, have not looked at the possible environmental use cases, and have merely dismissed it as greenwash. So the political forces, the European Central Bank, etc., they rely on these environmental NGOs doing a lot of their work for them and fighting against Bitcoin. So they will supply them with misinformation, using the levers and tools that they know will create moral outrage. And these environmental NGOs will then pick up on that, and they will perpetuate those messages and do a lot of the work of the central banks for them. And that's what we've seen happen. And so I've been one of the people, there's been a number of people who've really been at the forefront of fighting against these organizations, such as the Greenpeace US of this world, to shift that perspective with some success, but it's hard, long work.
Absolutely, Daniel. And that's why we want to continue getting your message out. Daniel is not afraid to identify the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, the European Central Bank, headquartered in Germany, and the Dutch Central Bank as principal architects of some of the propaganda that is coming out against Bitcoin. Daniel Batten, thank you so much for joining us today at the Bitcoin Layer. Please tell people where they can continue to read what you are writing right now about Bitcoin and the environment.
Well, I've just put out a newsletter, which you can see. It's batcoins.com. And I'm also writing on Twitter, so you can catch me there. I'm also on Nostra these days as well. My Twitter handle is @dsbatten.
With Daniel Batten, I'm Nick Bhatia. We'll catch you guys next time. Special thanks to River for sponsoring this channel. Purchase Bitcoin without any fees when you use River's DCA feature. River has become our trusted source of accessing the Bitcoin market because they don't use any third-party custodians. This is a very, very important thing to understand. River is not using another company to store the Bitcoin for them. They have their own multi-signature solutions, which means that they have designed their own way to make sure nobody else has responsibility for the Bitcoin for the time that you have River hold your Bitcoin for you on their platform once you have purchased it. So go check out river.com today. Thanks for sticking with us. As always, at the Bitcoin Layer, subscribe to our channel, subscribe to our Substack at thebitcoinlayer.substack.com so that you can follow along our latest research and analysis.